All right, hello and welcome. Welcome to today's video where we're going to be talking about projection and why we project our unconscious and subconscious judgments and shame and guilt onto others, and how we can start to become more aware of that in ourselves, and how we can handle it when we are projected onto, when people project their shame and their guilt and their judgment onto us, and how we can learn to not go into a shame spiral about that and not necessarily go into defense, and just see that we can navigate this in a way that is helpful for us and helpful for others, and that can be a little bit less triggering, and how we can take things a little bit less personally when we are being projected onto, because it's a really painful and it's a really it can be a very, very triggering experience to have someone project their shame and their guilt onto you, and to tell you that the way that you're living your life is wrong, or that the way that you are behaving is wrong, or that there's something wrong with you. And there's so much kind of tied into this and the ways that we think and human psychology. And so that's why I wanted to talk about this today, because we essentially live in a world where we are constantly projecting our own shame and our own guilt onto everyone. We live in a very gatekeepy society where we are culturally indoctrinated into segregating ourselves and excluding people and looking for who's the threat and looking for who's the wrong and the bad person, and figuring out ways of making people other, as in making ourselves feel like other people are bad and wrong and not one of us and not part of our group, and then figuring out how they're wrong and they're bad for being how they are. And rather than being able to empathize with one another and to see our ways of connection and to see what may actually going on beneath the surface and how culture has indoctrinated us, we are against one another. And it creates a lot of problems in our society, and it actually prevents us from being able to create a society that works well for all of us. So this projection of this shame and guilt goes beyond just making us feel individually bad about ourselves when people are mean to us, and it goes beyond us just doing it to other people, but it goes towards continuing to have our society operate in a way where we constantly feel on edge, and people feel like it's really difficult to find community and it's really difficult to find connection, and where we feel very isolated and where we feel very insecure, and the systems that benefit from that. Okay, so this is not just a small issue of projection and it not being a great thing that we project. It's actually a much bigger issue, and it's something that, again, I really wanted to talk about both in the individual context but also in the larger context. Okay, so again, if you are enjoying this content, if you get benefit from this content, I would really love to hear from you. So liking, commenting, sharing. I always want to hear what you have to say. If you want to show up for the lives that happen on my Instagram and my Facebook, I love your comments. I love your feedback. I love your questions. I'm always open to all of that. And if you want more, you can check out my mystery school. You can check out one-on-one coaching with me. I have lots of free resources on my YouTube, lots of free resources on my website, perceptiontrainers.com. So there's lots and lots and lots here for you. If there's any particular subject you want to dive into, I'm sure that I've expounded upon it many, 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 many times because I've been doing this for the last 10 years. There's a lot of content out there. So yeah, just putting that out there. There's lots of Perception Trainers content if this is something that resonates with you. And always feel free to reach out to me through direct message or email me at theperceptiontrainers.com if you have any questions about any of these things. I would love to answer. So that's that. Okay. So, projection. This is one of those things that, especially in the spirituality, self help, and personal growth world, I think has been turned into one of these just kind of token phrases that we throw around. And it can be used in a way that can be very toxic, if that's the word we want to use. It can be used in a way that's really unhealthy. And a way that we protect ourselves from really looking at our own behavior and how we might be the one that is causing the problem, or how we might be the one that is doing something that might not be the healthiest thing. And as a way of protecting our own self image and our own worldview, so as not to have to feel threatened in any way. Okay? So there is a lot of talk, again, in the spirituality, self help, and personal growth worlds. Let me know if you've experienced this, where people say, when you are trying to set a boundary, or when you are saying, this is something that you did that hurt me, or this is something that I'm not okay with, or you're trying to communicate your needs, or you're trying to communicate your perspective in some way, people say to you, you're just projecting. You're just projecting your shit. You're just projecting your trauma. You're just projecting whatever it is that's wrong with you. I did nothing wrong. I didn't hurt you. I didn't do anything. It's you that's doing the projecting. And like I say, this word can be used as a self-defense mechanism when we feel like someone is saying to us, like, look, what you did hurt me, and what you did didn't feel good for me. And people say, well, you're just projecting. Now, if that's ever happened to you, it can feel really awful. It can feel really invalidating. It can feel like people are just writing you off and telling you that your emotions and your experience don't matter. And this, I think, is a big reflection, again, of how our culture trains us not to have compassion for one another, and not to be able to empathize with one another, and to be in this constant state of self-defense and self-preservation. Now, calling them out on their poop. Yeah, exactly. So what I think we need to understand in general about how our culture works, and how we are conditioned to be in our culture, is that we are really conditioned that we are not safe. I think that is the very biggest bottom line. That we live in a culture that, unless you are operating within the bounds of the most kind of privileged among us, the most kind of, this is the right way to be. You're financially successful, able-bodied, neurotypical white dude. Really, like, at the end of the day, that's kind of like the gold standard of what a human is supposed to be. And if you operate in any way that's outside of that, and culture then does not serve you or make you feel safe or work for you in the way that it works for these other kind of people that are very privileged in our culture, that means that there's something wrong with you, that means that you're failing, that means that you're doing something wrong, because the system is working how the system should be working. The system is exactly how it should be. And if you are not benefiting from it, if it doesn't feel good for you, there's something wrong with you that you need to fix and you need to change. And we see this literally in every area of society, right? Like, we can see that, like, just look at something like LGBTQ rights and privileges, right? It's these people do not fall into the Christian standard binary of man and woman being married, having children, and propagating the species. And for some reason, because of how our culture works, that means that if you operate in this way, you do not deserve the same privileges, freedoms, rights, and safety as the people who occupy that standard of our culture. That's just one area, right? And we have lived in a world where for a very, 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 very long time, people who do not fall into the normal, what we would call normal, binary of gender expression and sexual expression and relational expression have been judged, shamed, guilted, blamed, and made to be literally unsafe simply because they don't operate within the way that the system says they should operate. And this has been something that has been normalized in culture. Do you see what I'm saying? Most people have been indoctrinated to believe that homosexuality, queerness, that anything outside of the gender binary, the sexual binary, makes that person wrong, bad, flawed, sinful. And there have been so many stories and so much narrative around how it's dirty, how it's shameful, how it's predatory, how it's dangerous, and how these people need to be seen as literal vermin or a problem or a threat to our children. And this narrative has been spread over and over and over and over and over again for centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries, to the fact that it's been literally like codified in law. And people have been genuinely unsafe in their physical bodies, in their mental situation, in their spirituality, in their level of self-love, because of society's judgment. When the real reality is that for as long as humans have existed, for as long as human history has been recorded, there have been humans who have fallen outside of the typical gender and sexuality binary. And this is a very normal, natural, forever and ever part of the human experience. But we project shame, blame, and guilt onto it as a way of preserving the status quo that the straight male and straight female being together is the way that it is supposed to be. And there are so many societal privileges that come with falling within that binary. There are so many privileges that come with being a man that has been married to a woman, with being a woman who is married to a man. There's literal cultural respect that comes with that. There's power, there's privilege. So on both sides of the spectrum, we're seeing that there's benefits to falling in line with what culture tells us to be, and there's real serious detriment to not falling in line. And we have been conditioned to accept that as being how it should be, because we are continually being fed these narratives that the people who fall outside of normal are bad, wrong, shameful, guilty threats in some way. And then many of us, everyone out there probably, who, when you yourself fall outside of the norm, rather than seeing your experience as something that's beautiful, as something that's natural, as something that's valid, as something that's important, and being able to see yourself as a completely equal member of society, you have been indoctrinated to shame, blame, and guilt yourself. You have been indoctrinated to see yourself as less than. You have been indoctrinated to accept shitty behavior from other people and from culture at large, because there's so much internalized shame around this, and so much internalized guilt, and so much internalized there must be something wrong with me because I'm not normal, quote unquote, that to even get to a point where you can fight for your own rights or ask for better behavior or any of these things is a massive journey, because you're already so beat down inside for just existing how you exist. And you're already so conditioned to be in a state of shaming, blaming, and guilting yourself, and trying to fix yourself and trying to get rid of yourself to protect yourself from the very real threat and harm that comes from being who you are in a society that is making that genuinely unsafe. Okay, and that's just one thing. If we look at things like Christianity and religion in general, so much of what happens within religion is we are taught to see what is natural to us as human beings. Our natural sexual impulses, our natural ways of thinking, our natural ways of interacting with the world, our needs, our wants, our desires, the things that we want and the things that we don't want, the things that work for us and the things that don't work for us. We are trained from day one within religion to see these things as wrong and bad and sinful and things that separate us from the love of God, and that we must be constantly policing and judging and shaming and guilting within ourselves. We go to church on Sunday and we are told that we are sinners, that we are fallen, that we are shameful. And this messaging over and over and over again convinces us to be in a constant state of self-micromanaging and suppression and denial and fixing from the very beginning of our lives for a lot of us. Because what is normal and natural to the human being has been made into something that we're trained to reject in ourselves and then to reject in other people. And if we just continue, same thing with if you're not able-bodied. We don't live in a culture that tends to have compassion for people who are chronically ill or who are disabled or who have mental illness. We don't live in a society where we say, okay, how can we support these people? How can we create systems that make it so that these people who don't have the same access to capacity as a able-bodied person does might have some ways in which society helps them out so that it's not so hard for them, so that everything doesn't have to be an uphill battle, but rather it's the opposite of that. People are shamed and blamed and guilted that they're not trying hard enough, that they're lazy, that they're welfare queens, that they're just not doing all the right things, they're not taking care of themselves, that it's their fault that they're sick or that they're disabled or that they're mentally suffering and they need to fix it. And then all of the societal conditions that come with that, like even if you're going to try to help yourself in these situations, you need to occupy a space in society where you can make enough money to do that, or where you are supported by somebody who makes enough money so that you can do that. And that is not accessible to every person. That is very deeply not accessible to every person. So we have all of this internalized shame around being different than the status quo, and everything being different from the status quo being labeled as wrong, bad, shameful, not how it should be. And we have internalized that and internalized that and internalized that to the point where, again, we project it onto other people and we project it onto ourselves, and we don't even realize that we're doing it, and we don't see why these norms are set in place and why we are so conditioned to attack and judge and shame and project onto one another and onto ourselves. Okay, because at the end of the day, we have to realize that when we are hating ourselves for not falling into the structures that have been told to us are the right way to be, we are then not looking at how the structures function. We are then not looking at why we are in the situation that we're in and why these things have been determined right and everything else has been determined wrong. We are not seeing the ways that these structures benefit certain groups of society at the detriment of everyone else, right? That this is really what this boils down to. The shame, the blame, and the guilt of human beings being the natural way that we are is all coming down to making sure that we are very busy gatekeeping ourselves and gatekeeping one another, so that those who are having the most power in our society can continue to have that power while we fight against ourselves and fight against one another instead of looking to the system and what could be really going on there, right? So long as you can create a society where people fear and judge and shame and guilt one another, and fear and judge and shame and guilt themselves, you can create any kind of culture you want that benefits you and have all the people not see it and not do anything about it, and actually, to their own detriment, work to uphold that as a way of trying to make themselves safe within this shitty culture that is never going to make them safe. That's really what's happening here. That we are a human species who carries around so much shame, blame, and guilt for not fitting in. Because, again, from the very beginning of our lives, from childhood onwards, not fitting in makes us unsafe. Yeah? From the very, very beginning of our lives, most of us experienced in our childhoods situations where we were not understood and loved and cared for by our caregivers, where we were not given the space we needed to grow and evolve and become our true selves, because our caregivers were already projecting onto us societal standards and their own ideas of what we needed to be and what we needed to do to make them happy, to serve them and their needs, or to be acceptable in culture based on what they perceive to be acceptable in culture. Their own conditioning and how they were raised to see what you have to do and what you have to be a good person was being projected onto us as children. Right? From the very, very beginning, we're being indoctrinated and conditioned by our caregivers to see these things as good, these things as bad, these things as right, these things as wrong. And if you are in a situation where your caregivers are not able to provide a safe, supportive, secure connection for you, if they pull away, if they're antagonistic, if they outwardly shame you, if there is any ways in which that they are constantly not meeting your needs and constantly making you feel insecure and like you are not going to be seen, heard, loved, respected, and provided for, this is going to be in your nervous system a huge red flag. This is going to spark all of your survival instincts. Because in this very delicate state of your life, we are fully and completely dependent upon our caregivers to provide us with everything that we needed. So them pulling away, them judging us, them shaming us, them not seeing us for how and what we are, is the exact same thing to us in our childhood as I'm not going to be safe, I'm not going to get my needs met, I'm not going to be provided for. And if that happens over and over and over and over and over again, we are then going to start to internalize that any part of us that we perceive to have been the reason why caregivers pulled away from us, shamed us, guilted us, abandoned us, abused us in any way, hurt us, didn't see us, we are going to perceive that those parts of self that were present at the time are the reason we were unsafe, are the reason caregivers did what they did. And we were then going to develop shame, blame, and guilt around these things as a way of trying to stop ourselves from expressing like that, from doing those things, from saying those things, from being those things, because it was a threat to our survival. That's the foundation for where we learn to shame, blame, and guilt ourselves. When we were in that very delicate time of completely depending upon our caregivers for love and acceptance, to be provision and giving us all the things that we needed, to get us out of pain and to get us into pleasure. And if there was any part of self that we perceived was the reason why that wasn't happening, even if it wasn't true, right? So for a lot of us, we're going to go back and we're going to do our inner child work, and we're going to realize that our caregivers never actually detested these parts of ourselves that were loud or that were whatever it is that we hate about ourselves. But rather, we were just making the connection that if when I do this, they respond to me in this way, even if that wasn't what was happening, right? We may go back and realize that caregivers were pulling away because they were exhausted and it had nothing to do with us. Or caregivers couldn't provide for us because they literally just did not have the resources to do it, and it didn't have anything to do with our behavior. But as children, we can't see that. As children, we can't process that. As children, we don't understand that. We are just going to say, caregivers did this. What was I doing that made them do that? And then we develop shame, guilt, and blame around those parts of self to try to protect ourselves from doing that again. We're trying to protect ourselves from these parts of self that we perceive are causing caregivers to pull away or not meet our needs. And therefore, these parts are existential threats to us. That's how we learn to hate ourselves. That's the very beginning of where we learn to hate ourselves. And then it's especially enhanced if it's actually being said, right? Like if caregivers are literally outrightly saying, like, you can't be this way, this is bad, this is wrong, this is shameful. That's even more self-hate, internalized shame, blame, and guilt. And then we grow up again in a society that does the exact same thing. That in order to get our needs met in society, in so many ways, we have to live up to the expectation of the status quo in order to get our needs met. We have to play the game. We have to try to fit ourselves into what is acceptable. Because when we don't, we are either rejected, shame, blame, and guilt socially. We have that feeling of never being loved and never being approved of and never being safe. Or, like we've talked about previously in this talk, it escalates to literally being unsafe. To it literally being an actual real situation where society is set up in a way that if you are this way, if you fall outside the norm, you are unsafe. You aren't going to have the same capacity to get your needs met as everyone else. You aren't going to be able to provide for yourself the way everyone else does. And rather than society seeing that and validating that and being able to be like, whoa, our structures are set up weird, that they don't support human life, we go, it's your fault. You're doing something wrong. You don't fall into the norms. It's your own fault that you're not getting your needs met. It's your own fault that you're not safe. It's your own fault that people are antagonizing you. It's your own fault that you can't hold your own boundaries. It's your own fault that you're a people pleaser. It's your own fault that you're chronically ill. And then, because we all have been indoctrinated into this, we gatekeep each other, right? That's when we have people who walk around judging one another, gatekeeping one another, telling one another, you can't be that way, that's wrong and bad, that's super shameful, that's terrible, you can't do that, you can't be that. Because we haven't taken the time to unpack our internalized shame and guilt enough that we can see where it's actually coming from. We project it out because we don't have self-awareness. That's really what it boils down to. We are just trying to keep ourselves safe by trying to see ourselves as the in-group, by trying to align with the in-group so that we can benefit from being in alignment with the in-group. That's what's happening. We gatekeep and we continue to perpetuate the shame and the guilt and the blame that culture tells us we are supposed to carry around. That this is what's right and this is what's wrong. And we gatekeep one another. Instead of being able to have compassion and curiosity for each other and different experiences, because we are so afraid for ourselves. And we are afraid for ourselves because society is set up in a way where we are so hyper individualistic, where literally it is a dog eat dog world out there, where we do operate in a way where if you don't fall inside the system, people are going to judge you, people are going to shame you, and you will possibly be hurt and harmed and not given opportunity to move up in the world, to find safety, to find security. People are not going to be on your side. You aren't going to have the same protections as the people that fall inside the norms. And there isn't a gold standard for how everyone is treated. We have racism, we have sexism, we have homosexuality or homophobia, we have all of these things, ableism, that say it's okay to treat these people who fall outside the norm as less than human because they are wrong, bad, harmful, and shameful. We have been culturally conditioned out of our empathy because we are so afraid for ourselves based on how culture has been set up. That's the real reason we have so much projection of shame and guilt onto one another. We're gatekeeping each other as a way of trying to protect ourselves from being cast out of the norms of society where all the benefits of society exist. Does this make sense? We have internalized the shame because it's been so heavily poured on us for our whole lives that it is right and proper to be a certain way, and that if you are different, that there's something wrong with you, right? Like, think about the narrative that so many of us have around people who don't fit the norm. The narrative that chronically ill people are just lazy, that they're not trying hard enough, that they're not doing the right things, they're not taking responsibility for themselves, that they did it to themselves on some level, that it's their fault and they deserve to be suffering. And if they can't work like a normal person, if they can't provide for themselves like a normal person, that's on them. People who, again, fall outside the gender sexuality binary. How many times have there been literal media campaigns to make us believe that these people are vermin, are predators, are unsafe, are wrong and bad and perverse in some way. That they just want to indulge all their physical needs and go on a sex rampage. And that's what that is. Like these narratives that foreign people are coming and taking our jobs and taking our resources, and they're violent and they're criminals and they're ruining our perfect society. These are horrible messages that don't have any basis in truth most of the time. But they're the messages that we're fed in order to continue to feed the idea that it's okay to hate and shame and project these people onto these people. So then, if you are someone who falls outside the norm in any way, you are going to have that internalized shame projected onto you. And right, like we know that in so many ways, in so many situations, the people who are the most prejudiced against a group of people tend to be the people who are suppressing these things in themselves the most. As cliche as that is, the people who are against themselves the most will externalize that onto the culture around them. The people who feel the most insecure, the most unloved, the most unsafe are the ones who are going to project their shame and their guilt onto everyone else. And the people who really want to maintain the power structure the way that it is, because it benefits them, are going to be the ones who stand up the most to project that shame and that guilt and that blame onto others, so that society will continue to see others as being wrong, bad, and shameful and guilty, as less than human, so that we won't demand that they get treated better. Because the demand for people to be treated better, the demand for more equal opportunity for more human beings to have safety, provision, and access would mean the power structure would need to shift. It would mean we could no longer have billionaires. It would mean corporations could no longer have profit in every quarter. It would mean we wouldn't be so easily manipulated into over-consuming and overproducing to try to earn our value and earn our safety. It would mean people would have to literally give up privileges that they occupy by being close to the power. And people don't want to do that. People don't want to give up that power. So they make a monster out of the people that they're exploiting. They make monsters out of the people who are not falling in line with the status quo in order to keep this narrative going that they have the right to be where they are. They have the right to be doing what they're doing because they are the good ones. They are the pure ones. They are the righteous ones. And everyone else is sinful and wrong and bad and shameful and guilty, and therefore deserving of this terrible treatment. Right? And that is the culture we've been indoctrinated into. That is why we have so much internalized shame and guilt and blame, and why we project it onto others so much. Because to actually take a step back and start to unpack this, most of the time, the only people who are going to do that are the people who are being harmed by it. So much of the time, the people who are doing the work to unpack the cultural shame, blame, and guilt are the people who themselves fall outside of the norm, fall outside of the power structure, and are trying to figure out how to live a life where they can be accepting of themselves and where they can fight for their own safety and fight for their own rights because they are not being benefited by the structures and by society. And this is a huge problem because, again, so much of the time, fighting that fight is incredibly challenging to do, just period, end of story, bottom line, with our own conditioning and our own experiences of being made to be unsafe and why we hate these parts of ourselves, because it literally did make us unsafe to be who we were. It really did get us judged and rejected, and people were mean to us, and we were made to be very, very unsafe, and we literally have less opportunity and safety than everyone else. So just doing that for ourselves is incredibly challenging. To not hate yourself for being who you are, when that doesn't fall in line with what you were conditioned you are supposed to be, is some of the hardest work we will ever do, because it's not as though culture is set up to support that. In fact, culture is set up the exact opposite way, right? Culture is set up to continue to have you shaming and blaming and guilting and rejecting yourself. And the moment you start to say, well, what if I don't have to? What if I don't have to hate myself? What if I don't have to reject myself? Culture is going to swoop in and be like, yes, you do. Do not like that about yourself. You are wrong. You are bad. You are shameful. So just doing that work internally, the world is going to be against you. People are going to be against you. Family is going to be against you. Friends are going to be against you. Everyone's going to be gatekeeping you. I've been preaching this message of self-love for the last 10 years, and I can't tell you how many times people have come and said, this is dangerous. If you really learn to love yourself, you're just going to become the worst version of yourself. You're going to spiral into just being a terrible, selfish, horrible piece of shit. That this self-love work is dangerous, it's bad, it's wrong. And you really should hate yourself. And you really should figure out what's wrong with you. And you are a problem. Right? We're so deeply conditioned never, never, never to question it. So just doing it in and of ourselves is a huge challenge. But then from there, we start to say, no, society needs to change. Structures need to change. It's not fair. It's not that I'm struggling because there's something wrong with me. I'm struggling because society is literally set up in a way where for me to exist how I exist means that I don't have the same safety, rights, and freedoms as everyone else. And that's not okay. And then we are fighting for our own selves, and culture is going to fight against us. The people who have the actual power to change things aren't going to listen. And then again, the people who have the power to change things look at those who are fighting against the system, who are asking for more equal rights, who are saying the system is broken and flawed, and say, those are bad people. Those are the threats. Those are the ones you need to gatekeep, everyone. Reject them. See them as bad. See them as wrong. See them as violent. See them as whatever. In order to keep society continuing to judge and blame and shame and guilt them, so that they won't listen to what's actually happening. They won't listen to their experience. They won't listen to why they're rising up, to why they're demanding change. We'll just keep gatekeeping them. because we're not unpacking our own unconscious biases. When we fall into the norms, this is where I think it is the most important for us to be unpacking our projections of shame, blame, and guilt. When we are benefiting from the system, when we are the ones that have proximity to power, it is most important for us to be looking at who and what we shame and guilt and blame as being wrong, bad, evil, not okay. And to really question where those beliefs came from, where those narratives came from, where those stories came from, and who benefits from us believing those stories and perpetuating those stories and perpetuating those narratives. Because when we start to do that unpacking work, we are going to start to see things for how they really are. That these people are not evil, that they are not wrong, that they are not bad, but they are being exploited by our system. We're going to start to see the injustice. And then those of us that have the proximity to power can start to demand change, can start to be allies, can start to listen and empathize and understand what it's really like for these people who don't fall into the norm. And instead of blaming and shaming and projecting onto them, we can start to say, how do we create a society where it's safer for them to exist? Because that's really what we want, and that's really what we need. And that's what this work is all about. When we can start to unpack our own shame, blame, and guilt, all those areas where we are rejecting ourselves, where we are shaming ourselves, where we are blaming ourselves and guilting ourselves, and assuming that there's something wrong with us. When we can start to do that inner work and to develop compassion for our own experience and how we got to where we are and why we do the things that we do and why we operate the way that we operate, we can then start to develop a healthy capacity to see where there's nothing wrong with us and to honor who and what we are and to make space for that on one side. And then on the other side, we can start to see where we made adaptations that might not be healthy right now, how we cope and numb and stimulate and self-sabotage, and the ways that we allow people to walk all over us and our people-pleasing behaviors and all of these things. And we can see that again, not as something wrong, bad, shameful, and broken about us, something that should be judged and criticized and that we need to fix about ourselves, but rather we can start to see it for where it really came from. This happened because I wasn't safe. This happened because I perceived I wasn't safe. This happened because this is how I had to operate in order to protect myself. I developed these habits not because I'm broken or shitty, but because it was the best I knew to do at the time when I was growing up and didn't have a perfectly secure connection. And then we can start to see, where are my needs not getting met? Where are things happening to me now that I don't feel good about, that I've been indoctrinated and cultured to believe I must fit into and I must do? Where is it that I need to support myself in different ways, that I need to ask for help in different ways? We can start to actually show up for ourselves in saying, okay, these are parts of me that are trying to get my needs met in the only ways they know how. So how can I upgrade that? Through deeper self-understanding. How are these things trying to help me? How is this a part of who I am? And how can I learn to allow myself to be that way, even if other people don't like it, or can't make room for it, or judge it. And then we can start to do that on a more collective level. When we learn to do that for ourselves, when we learn to have that compassion and that empathy for ourselves, to see our own humanity, that's when we can start to turn around and see everyone else's humanity. We can start to understand that people are not evil. They're not bad. They're not wrong. They're hurting. They're harmed. They have problems. Society is complicated and complex. And rather than being just another one of these people that are here to gatekeep and to tell people that they're wrong and they're bad and they're shitty for being how they are, we can start to say, okay, what is your actual experience? What's happening? What's going on here? What kind of support do you need? What kind of shifts in culture do we need? What if people are not shameful and guilty and evil and horrible, but they're just doing the best that they can within systems that make it very challenging for a lot of people to just exist? We can start to connect to our own humanity as we unpack our own internalized shame, blame, and guilt, to seeing ourselves more as human, and then being able to see others in their humanity. And that is how we are going to create a better system. That's how we're going to get out of this constant state of projecting internalized shame into being able to see what's really going on, and how we can be a part of the change we want to see on this planet. So I really want to encourage you, everywhere where you hate yourself, I want you to open to the idea that this part of you is not bad. It's not wrong. It's not shameful. That you are doing the best that you can to fit into a world that is generally antagonistic to our humanity. So what do you need? What are you actually feeling? What's really going on for you? How were you conditioned that you have to be a certain way in order to be good enough? Where were you made unsafe? Where were your needs not met? This self-love work is the foundation for a new system. Because again, when we can do this for ourselves, we're going to start to be able to do it collectively. And then we are going to demand a better system that works for all of us. Because we are going to have a much deeper and better understanding of our humanity and the humanity of everyone else. So this is why I harp on this so much. In every single one of my videos, in the mystery school, we have just like an entire curriculum that's all about unpacking our internalized shame and guilt. Because that is what is keeping us from being able to see reality, the reality of what we actually need, right? It's the shame, blame, and guilt keeps us on the never-ending self-improvement roller coaster, treadmill, whatever you want to call it, that goes nowhere. Where we're constantly trying to fix something in ourselves that isn't broken. And we're not seeing the real need. We're not seeing the real emotion. We're not seeing the true root cause of why we feel how we feel and why we're doing what we're doing. So therefore, we can't find better for ourselves. We can't support ourselves in a better way. We can't get to something better because we're stuck in a delusion that we're broken, bad, wrong, and shameful, and that is why we are in pain. So when we can break out of that, we're literally breaking out of the matrix And then we can start to see others in this way. We can start to be like, whoa, right? Like, I've been really conditioned to see this lifestyle as evil. But is that true? I've been conditioned to see these people as lazy, as bad, as wrong. But is that true? Is that really what's happening? And again, who benefits from me thinking that way? Who benefits from me fighting against these people? Who benefits from me seeing people as being wrong, bad, shameful, and guilty? For their natural human expression, or for the ways that they're literally acting out. That they're acting out the ways they are being harmed, and the ways that society is not working for them, and the ways they are being abused. And so maybe they're not asking for support in the most mature way. But like, again, how can we understand that? How can we empathize with that? How can we see where that's coming from? So that we can start to be better supports and allies for a better culture, a better world that supports us better. Okay? So when someone projects their shame and blame and guilt onto you, I really want to encourage you that even if you're doing something that's harmful, even if there's a part of what they're saying that is true, you're not doing it because you're bad, wrong, shameful, guilty, and broken. That's an opportunity to look for, how is this me trying to get my needs met in the only way I know how? Where did I learn this? What am I trying to accomplish? And how can I support myself in doing things differently so that I can get my needs met in a different way? And you can also say to yourself, is this a projection? Are they shaming a part of me that is not harmful, that is not bad, that is not actually wrong or causing any problem, but is just falling outside the norms of culture? And they are gatekeeping without realizing that that's what they're doing. We want to have that self-reflection. Even if what you're doing is harmful, it still doesn't mean that you're evil or there's something wrong with you. It means this is how you learn to get your needs met in the only ways you knew how. So how can you support yourself in upgrading your behavior to something that will work better for you and be less harmful for you? And then if it's not that, how can you start to appreciate that people have been conditioned to reject parts of you that they are probably rejecting in themselves because of playing into the power structure? That's really what's going on. It's not that you should hate yourself. It's not that there's something wrong with you. It's that they're gatekeeping a societal standard that is not helpful for any of us. Because even the people who are in positions of power are not actually benefiting from this. They might be financially benefiting, but they are destroying the planet, and they are not happy because they have to be separated from their own humanity. This way of being, this culture of shame, blame, and guilt is literally working for no people. Not in real reality. So it needs to change. We need to upgrade. And it starts with us. It starts with unpacking the shame, blame, and guilt we have and the ways that we project that so that we can be allies for a better world. Okay? You're not broken. You're not bad. You're not wrong. You're not shameful. So if you start from that foundation, what do you need to be supported? And then how can you support others in their humanity? That's what we want to do. Okay? Okay. So that's it for today. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, you can leave them everywhere. Come join the lives in my Instagram and my Facebook if you want to give me your questions while I'm recording. I love that. I'm always open to that. I love your feedback. I want to make this dynamic and interactive because I want it to be um, serving you and serving what's actually on your mind and what's coming up for you right now and what you're working through. Okay? So thank you. I hope you have a good day. Thank you for being here, and I will see you next week.